I used to work in really environmental management fields. I've been involved in fisheries in the past and waste resources management. I worked for Oxfordshire County Council Waste Management Group in the early 80s. It was one of the most well-respected and effective counties as a result of the work that we did in reducing waste and recycling. And during the process of that work, I came to the conclusion that awareness raising, even community support, community development work in community action groups, and policy were going to have a very small level of impact to the kind of impact that I felt, and many of you here I'm sure will believe is necessary in terms of the way we function as a society to ensure a sustainable future. And I guess I came to the conclusion that while it was a long shot, that so much of the sort of problems in society seem to be related in terms of psychological well-being or psychological illness, depression, and the way that people consumed goods and breakdown of community all seem to be connected from my point of view. And the only way that I could see of really having some strong impact on this was to find a way of teaching meditation to a wide audience, to make everybody be able to engage in a sort of internal change process as a social process, to create a groundswell, if you like, or systemic change in society. So that was my fantasy just over 10 years ago or so. And that led me to getting involved with establishing the Oxford Mindfulness Centre and then developing a way of teaching mindfulness based on that in the workplace. So that's my motivation, and my intention remains the same, finding a way of doing this, teaching, broadly speaking, meditation, which has become focused around the idea of mindfulness, to impact society in a significant way to ensure a happier, healthier society and a more sustainable future. So, to start the talk then, I just wanted to refer back to something that's been on a lot of people's minds recently, and that's the referendum on Brexit. There was a really interesting Panorama programme that came out about a week after that, where the presenter, Adrian Chiles, went back to his home city of Birmingham and asked people, mostly people that had voted to leave Europe, why they did it. And I'd just like to relate a couple of things that 2 or 3 of those people said as a way of looking at what is the social issue that we're dealing with, from people talking about why they voted to leave Europe. The first person that Adrian Chiles spoke to was a youngish woman called Katie, who'd had a run of bad luck. She'd had a stillborn baby. She'd had an accident working in a care home and was on disability benefit and experienced chronic pain and chronic fatigue, and then her flat had just flooded. And she felt empowered. It was the first time that she voted. She felt empowered to challenge the whole system by saying, get out of Europe. That was how it focused for her. And she felt very pleased and empowered that she'd managed to contribute to that. The next, one of the next people that Adrian Chiles talked to was a guy called John, who had been in the army and an ex-steel worker. He was very attached to his community on a council estate. It had been something that had been there for most of his life. But he was experiencing these sort of, the post-industrial decay of not finding work and not and finding it difficult to support his family. And you could see he wanted to support his family, he wanted to have a meaningful job, but he couldn't get a meaningful job. And community was a really important thing to him. And he saw Eastern European immigration as a threat to his ability to competing against him and undercutting his ability to get work. The third character was a guy called Cooley, who's third generation Indian, whose grandparents came over and settled. And his view, he ran a burger van. His view was that his generation, or the kind of immigrants that came over from the Commonwealth, had a very different approach or intention in coming to Great Britain, as a kind of, the motherland, supporting the British economy, British culture, and integrating with British culture. And he felt that European immigrants were different in that they were just coming here because it was a good way of making money, they could send money home. So that's, if you like, the social background of some of the issues that I think that we need to think about or we need to address as a society in the future. They focus, I think, centrally around family, community, and meaningful activity. And the danger that comes out of that, which is looking for an enemy, a cause that is foreign to our own making. I wrote the next bit and I thought I'd like to just read this because then I don't miss anything out. So, when things get difficult, people may come together to work for the collective good, but there is often a sting in the tail. People identify with an in-group and often see people who do not fit that identity as the source of the problem. Today, the source of the problem is our collective use of resources, population growth, and the way that globalization creates wealth, but results in a greater sense of inequality between the haves and the have-nots. Historically, when things get out of balance, there's a financial crisis, and war creates a clean slate. Is it possible for people to come together to work for a global sense of good? If so, we need to find a way to tip the balance from self-interest to a universal sense of compassion. We need to find ways of building a sense of community. So if you like, that's what I want to talk about. So I just want to briefly describe the history of what has become a major phenomenon in the last decade or so of mindfulness. I think more and more there's more analysis of the emergence of mindfulness coming out, certainly looking at the sources of this approach to meditation that came out of Southeast Asia. If you read up on it, it's very clearly a very modern creation, even though there are claims from practitioners within a broad range of insight meditation practices that believe that it is the original method of the Buddha. But the actual techniques were developed around 100 years ago, either in response to colonialization in Burma or as a response or a part of a modernization program to resist colonization in Thailand. So they were very much appealing to a modernistic sense of cause and effect. And out of the Burmese approach, the idea came that by examining our own psychological process, we could understand the way our own minds work and gain insight into the nature of things through that psychological self-examination. This clearly had appeals to the Western mind and became I would argue, a kind of self-help meditation practice in a culture that where people feel stressed and anxious, mainly in America, and produced the Insight Meditation Society approach to Insight Meditation. And those sources, combined with a Western approach to Zen, which was very much, stressed the importance of silent sitting, that John Kabat-Zinn was involved with, who created the first sort of standardized course that was produced or used in a hospital environment that could be reproduced, which was then picked up by clinical psychologists in the 90s doing research to find a novel way to prevent recurrent depression, so becoming increasingly psychological in its explanation, and then testing that in clinical trials, which really led to, I would argue, the explosion of interest in mindfulness in Western culture that we are witnessing now, and the development of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So that's the book that was published to describe that approach in 2002. If you do look at the rate of publications of academic journals or articles that talk about mindfulness or studies on mindfulness, the explosion of interest in the academic world took place around 2000, when this main study was starting to be published. And so now that exponential explosion of publications has reached about 700 publications a year. Following that, Professor Mark Williams, who was one of the key developers of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, he was at Bangor and then moved to Oxford, and then was the key, I think, the key author of what became a self-help version of the same book. So this was the same thing, but in a self-help book. That was very successful, and I don't wish to negate the value of these things. They've helped an awful lot of people, and they are changing many ways in which we understand ourselves in society. So they have brought great benefits. And then following that, a guy called Danny Penman, who was a journalist, approached Mark Williams really to make this more accessible. And this book was Danny Penman wrote with Mark Williams on, which has become one of the biggest bestseller self-help books around, and it's very good. With a shorter course, much better explanation, much easier to read, and structured more clearly so that people can understand what it's talking about. So there's a movement here to beginning to explain what's happening from a psychological perspective and making it more accessible and more widely accessible to youth, but still focusing on managing stress, really. The title says it all: Managing Mindfulness, a Practical Guide to Finding Peace in a Frantic World. And it's this model that I used as the course book to develop a workplace training program. But when I got into the workplace, and it's very nice to see Chris Ridge here, who really started this whole process of teaching his colleagues in what's the largest corporate veterinary provider of corporate veterinary veterinary services in the British Isles, and actually now in Europe because it's so big, a mindfulness course for them, because vets actually have a very stressful job, and they have lots of problems related to stress-related conditions, and even suicide. Their suicide rate is reckoned to be about 4 times the national average. So there are many reasons for that. But anyway, so they were a really useful audience to develop a training program. And I began to realize that teaching people in a group in the workplace was a social process. It wasn't all about a group of individuals that are learning about mindfulness. And I started to use that social process as a way of helping or teaching people to understand how their emotions and reactions and sense of identity or thoughts about themselves came about because of the way that they were interacting in the training room. So this became, if you like, the vehicle for training. And subsequently, I have become more aware of theoretical foundations of thinking about mindfulness in a modern context, that really talk about it as a social embodied process. In fact, who we are is a social embodied process. We're not a collection of isolated individuals with sort of psychological machinery whirring away that interacts like robots. You know, we're changing all the time. And if you like, that's where Ratnadeva gave an introduction saying that I was interested in bringing the philosophical foundations of Buddhist thinking and I suppose the foundations of compassion in Buddhist thinking into mindfulness, teaching mindfulness. I would say that here, understanding in a workplace environment the way we interact and how that changes our sense of self is really still about more to do with the Buddhist idea of no self, beginning to become aware of the fact that our sense of self changes on the way we feel and interact with others around us. And in actual fact, one of the things that happens is that when we feel comfortable in a social environment, the sense of self almost falls away. What is mine is yours. What is yours is mine. It's a shared, collective thing. And that's really the objective of the training approach that I've developed, which is to try and get a group of people in the workplace to feel more connected and more able to share information and resources to support each other. And that actually creates the psychological conditions where people can perform more effectively. They can relate to each other more effectively. They can listen to each other more effectively. They can manage teams more effectively. There's more willingness to contribute to the overall benefit of the group rather than individuals working competitively against each other for their own benefit. So, if you like, that's moving from this idea of what we might describe as a value-free intervention, psychological intervention in therapy, to something that has broader implications in a social process that actually begin to produce value-related behaviour. A lot of management approaches look at creating shared values in an organisation and aligning people around those values. But so often that's a kind of top-down thing superimposed that everyone's supposed to align to. So this hopefully is a method that can start to be used in an organisation where there is a social group that's enabling the organisation to change and build a sense of alignment to shared values that are more about making a positive contribution within the organisation and as a whole in the way in which that organisation interacts in society. I'd just like to mention briefly that there are a number of criticisms that have come from, I would argue, certain Buddhist opinions that have looked at mindfulness and said, a number of years ago I was talking at Buddhafield, really trying to encourage people that are interested in Buddhism to get involved in mindfulness. I was talking about it, explaining that I felt it's going to become a major phenomenon, that Buddhists that have an interest in meditation and teaching meditation should get involved and become part of that and influence that with their own experience. But there have been criticisms for its individualistic approach, to start with the criticisms of, you can't take mindfulness out of the tradition and use it just to help people as a self-help process. But people began, there's a lot of evidence and a lot of people, many Buddhists and many members of Triratna I've met that have trained to teach MBCT or MBSR, and I think they'll vouch for the fact that this brings an awful lot of benefit to a lot of people and gives them an opportunity to interact with a wider society. But then the criticism moved, you can't take ethics out of it you're teaching it as a value-neutral therapy. So, oh, well, I suppose there's some intrinsic ethics there in that you're helping people. The criticism then moved to, oh, well, you can't take this into an organisation. That's all about greed and making money. And again, I suppose, whether it was last year or before, anyway, more recently I've talked about what I think is the value of teaching mindfulness in organisations, perhaps as a stealth approach to changing organisations systemically. But I suppose the difference here is now I'd like to say explicitly, when you bring a group of people together and you do something as simple as this, you change the dynamic of that culture, and actually you intrinsically bring into that culture values that are ethical, because you're getting people to listen to their own emotional experience, their own body-based felt experience, and that intrinsically results in a more human, compassionate, interactive environment that then creates a culture. And that's what people are reporting in the workplace. When it is taught in the workplace, it has cultural impacts on the workplace. So I want to explicitly build that into the process now, to start to explain that this is what is happening. And that's where I'm moving in the development of the training programs that I'm using. So, one of the traditional ways of talking about the Dharma is to talk about the first noble truth of suffering as the problem. So I've briefly talked about this, or in the introduction, but the first noble truth of suffering that we're looking at here on a social level is individualism, I would argue, a breakdown of community, globalization, and inequality. This is what we're trying to manage to create a better society, a more sustainable future. So, if mindfulness does help people to cope with the difficult conditions of modern society, it could be just helping them to manage those better as individuals, or manage their own lives better as individuals that aren't coping, the ones that are falling by the wayside. That's not changing things at all. That's just helping them cope. So that really becomes more about social control than it does about social change, if it's just helping people to cope. And it wouldn't be the first time that what we would recognise as mindfulness has been used as a social control tool. I think it's something that we should recognise as something that we need to think about or try to work around and understand. It's certainly accounted, there are historical accounts and academic descriptions of the way in which mindfulness was used in Japan to encourage certainly the armed forces to disengage from their emotional reaction to the horror of warfare to be effective fighting tools in the service of the greater sense of self of the Japanese empire and the imperial ego of the emperor. So we don't want that kind of mindfulness. So mindfulness can be used to help us diffuse, so if you like, destructive thoughts. But it can also be used and the emotional reaction to destructive thinking that can result in stress, anxiety, or depression. But it can also be used to diffuse, I would argue, ethically legitimate emotions that arise out of the experience of injustice. How do we channel those valid emotions that may express themselves, for example, in anger, to a constructive end? It's very easy to get angry about some of the things that are going on in the world. So, coming back to this sense of self, I'd like to trace it back to that sense of self and the mind. One of the questions that I ask often at the beginning of the training or in one of the early classes of the training courses is, where is the mind? And, people, obviously I'm expecting people or encouraging people to point to their heads and their brains, which is very much the sort of the modern idea of the mechanics behind the mind or the psychological process. So I'll respond, well, yes, that's how a lot of us think of that in society today, as the mind being something to do with the brain. But if you ask people in a medieval culture, they're more likely to point to the heart as the seat of the mind. And if you ask people in the rainforest, they're quite likely to say in the trees. So, it's a cultural definition, a cultural idea of consciousness that we have in our culture that's a separate phenomenon that arises out of this complex set of neurological processes. It's not intrinsic to our experience. It's a social, cultural thing that's come out of a scientific way of looking at the world and an individualistic, reductionist way of looking at the world, I would argue. Just to show you, this is a really nice exercise that I use, which has got body maps of emotions. So people in the training then get an idea of the fact that their emotional experience is an embodied process that has different qualities of sensations with different emotions. So then that's leading the training into an idea of understanding what's going on in the physical embodied experience as part of the mind being embodied. So, how are we doing for time? Okay. So really what I'm trying to do is shift the emphasis of understanding mindfulness from a mindfulness of psychological process, an internal understanding of our own psychological process, to a mindfulness of relatedness, and how that's both social, and how that social relatedness produces a sense of self, and how then through the practice of sitting meditation itself, it becomes an experience of a socially constructed self, and how that relates to our internal experience as a mirror of our social experience. So that's what I'm arguing. That's why I'm saying that here, mindfulness, I think, has a powerful potential for social change, because both in a group doing this together, we feel stable or safe and connected, because we're not having to prove anything to each other. Many people find it much easier to go to a meditation class or a meditation group because they get that sense of social support. So there's a place of safety in which we don't need to do anything to defend who we are or prove who we are. And we learn that internally when we sit still and just observe or become aware, bring our awareness to our internal experience as a reflection of our social experience, in this case of ease and calm and clarity in a state of a wakeful embodiment. So I've talked a little bit about making so changing that theory to applying that as a training process, so that it becomes something that's much more to do with the way in which a group of people, the experience that I've had is primarily in organizations, but I don't see any reason why this couldn't be something in a communal process as well, to help social groups in all sorts of different contexts function more effectively. I mean, it's nothing new, but I think Triratna is one of the most obvious examples that have consciously tried to do this with an explicit Buddhist model adapting to Western society. What I'm saying is I'd like to see analogues of that in a secular capacity. We don't, I believe, need to refer to the Buddhist tradition to do this. I think it's useful to look at what we can draw from the Buddhist tradition to inform a modern secular approach, in the end to achieve what I believe is the most important goal, and that's social rather than, in this case, in the Buddhist context, attaining enlightenment or attaining nirvana. My view is that that's a social process. The Buddha talked about the most important thing being friendship in the Sangha, on one occasion. He talked about, or as the whole practice, I think it's Ananda, correct me if I'm wrong, explained to the Buddha that he thought that friendship was very important. The Buddha said, no, friendship in the Sangha is the whole path. I don't see why that can't be a larger social process where we learn to interact with each other in community, and how community has to shape itself within a really dynamic context of movement of individuals in a globalized economy, trying to see it like that. Maybe having smaller groups of people in a secular context that are coming together to do that. I mean, one of my ideas is to have a website where there are, mindfulness groups that you could have a register of mindfulness groups that anyone could find out about and drop in and out, that kind of thing. So trying to think of ways to create structures where this is possible. I'm just going through my notes and realise that most of the last section of my notes I've already talked about, so I don't want to repeat myself too much. If you could excuse me a second, I'll just go through them, see if there's anything that I want to sum up with particularly. I'll just go through these points as a summary. So there's a theoretical framework for social embodied mindfulness. It leads to a pedagogical process, a teaching process that presents that as the objective rather than the objective of stress reduction or enlightenment. It's a social process that is the objective, a community process, as an objective of social change. It gives us an insight into the changing nature of who we think we are and how we respond. We can become much more flexible as a result of having that insight into the way that we construct our own self in different contexts, and perhaps be more able to choose the kind of self that we want to adopt, to be more productive and socially engaged and compassionate. It develops a self-acceptance, acceptance of self, and kindness towards other, because our internal experience is a reflection of our social experience. It's a development of an experiential embodied ethics that can naturally arise from becoming more aware of our own experience in a social context. Mindfulness becomes a driver for insight and social engagement. And practicing mindfulness in a social group or community or workplace creates the context for a mindfulness practice to create a bridge from mindfulness to secular ethics. This is the big challenge, from a value-neutral scientific process to create a set of secular ethics and values that we can all ascribe to without reference to tradition in modern society. We want to find a way that we can say, yes, we believe this is socially true, and it doesn't come from a religious authority or religious tradition. Supported by shared values in the group, we are social beings and our emotional lives matter. Changes the consensus that self-interest and greed is the driver of economic success, to recognizing that the quality of our experience, the quality of our life, is based on how good we feel about our actions as social beings, not on how much we have. And that can really change, I believe, the way in which people look at resources for themselves and the benefits that they can gain experientially by finding ways of distributing the resources that they command. emotional life, ethics, social equality makes economic and political sense. It certainly makes sense in terms of a sustainable future.